Hi, and welcome to this AI anti-sharp video. And today we are looking at the Model Context Protocol again and into MCP auth. Because in the past we have looked at MCP by itself without any authentication. We have looked at MCP auth with an API key. And at that end of that video, I mentioned that OAuth was a problem that I hadn't figured out, and I needed some more time. And while this is still work in progress, I wanted to share that we have come a little further in this, but also figured out what is the main problem when using OAuth in Entra ID. So let's get into it. So in order for figuring out that OAuth can actually very easily be implemented if you just want to use application permissions and use a client secret. But in order for this to actually give any value to me, at least, there is these 4 rules and one nice to have that I want to go through. So just to understand that, yes, anyone can actually make OAuth work if they just have enough secrets and stuff. That's actually not what I'm after. So what I'm after is I want to use OAuth against Microsoft Entra ID. There's Auth0, there's Keycloak, there's all kinds of others that actually can do this. But Microsoft Entra is the one I want to use, and that actually is one of the problems that I will go through in a second. But since all my users are in Microsoft Entra ID, that's what I want to use. The second is that I want to use delegate permissions, meaning that I want to have someone log in as part of OAuth and actually get a user back. Because if we just use application, we would just get that the application logged in, not that it was behalf of this user or this user. So delegate permissions is very important, because else why have something as OAuth when you could just use an API key? So the delegate permissions is that you actually log in as you and I log in as me, and we can have the tools be able to actually know who authenticated and act in different ways based on the user that logged in. The third part is also part of that. So I don't want any secrets on the client side. In the client side, there should only be a URL to a remote server, and it should auto-discover what that remote server can do, log in, and do the authentication. And then I want it to be consumed by the commercial MCP clients like Visual Studio Code, Codex, ChatGPT, and the various other tools that can use MCP servers. The final goal is not too important, but it would be nice, and that would be that it's easy to debug, that you can do this on a local environment. And I have achieved some of these, but not all of them. So let's go through that. So I am able to use OAuth against Microsoft Entra in the code we will see in a little while. I am able to do delegate permissions, so we can actually, inside some of the tools, check who is the user, and we could react based on that. I am able to do no secrets at all on the client side and only give a remote server URL. But where it becomes difficult is that not all of the commercial MCP clients are actually enabled to do the pre-registration, as it's called, against Microsoft Entra ID. So Visual Studio Code can do it. So I have a perfect login flow for that. Codex cannot do it at all. It supports a different way of doing things that Entra can't do. More about that later. And ChatGPT is sort of middle ground where it seems to work, but then it just throws an exception saying something went wrong, and it can't tell me what is wrong. It could be a little thing, or it could be that simply not support Entra ID at all. The final thing here is if it's easy to debug. Unfortunately, I have not found a good way to do that. So I actually need to, every time I made a change to the code, I need to deploy it to a server in order to check. Luckily, that don't take so long time, but I can't get it work with localhost. It's probably something to do with VS Code not working too well with local development certificates, but that's just the way it is, and it hasn't been too big a problem. But of course, being able to set breakpoints would have been nice during this process. So a little about the thing here with Codex and ChatGPT not consuming it correctly, and that is because when MCP ORD came along, it used something called dynamic client registration, which is a very low-level version of OAuth, where it doesn't really need any server setups or anything. It would just be that here's a user, now that user is running. And Microsoft Entra is actually not keen on this system to the point where they don't support it. And most other providers have it off by default and tell it's risky to use. So for that reason, what I've been trying for the last month or so is actually not even supported in Microsoft Entra ID. I could go to Auth0 or some of the others, but that's not my goal. So slowly, the MCP clients are getting more integrations into doing this. Some of them need perhaps a client ID in order to work with this, but at least we can get rid of all the secrets. And that is still my goal. But this is the main reason why this is work in progress. I can't really use it for anything if I want to go against Codex, because Codex only support dynamic client registration. At some point they might support more, and then what we have built here would actually work. But let's go into what it is. If you feel already this is not worth your time because it's not a working, 100% working thing, then cut the video short. But else, if you are interested in what this can do and perhaps help me along with trying to figure out if there is a way around some of these, despite only working with dynamic, by setting some extra properties, then by all means. But what we need to do in order to do this is, of course, we need to write some code. And in our case, it will be an ASP.NET, and I put that up onto a web app in Azure. But it should just be hosted somewhere in order to work. We then have our MCP client, of course, which is, in my case, here Visual Studio Code, where we need to do some login. And that login needs to happen against a client app registration up in Entra. Next slide will show some about that. And that client app registration will talk to a server app registration, which is the one that does the work between the code and Entra ID. So those are the moving parts. We need to write some code, but we also need to do two things up in Azure. So up in Azure, portal.azure.com, we need to find Microsoft Entra ID, and we need to do two app registrations. So we have app registration down here, and we need to do normal app registrations. If you have tried this before, doing any kind of authentication, it's exactly the same. So in my case, I made an MCP server and an MCP client. And up in the server, you don't need to do very much, but you need to do some very specific things that are very hard to find. The first thing is you just need to make the server. So you can see here I have done nothing special. There's no client credentials, there's no redirect URLs, there's nothing special set up here. Inside the expose and API, we do, however, need to make an application ID URI, and we need to expose a scope. In my case, I've called the scope access as user, but you can call it anything. And that's the only thing we need to expose here, and then, of course, take care of getting our client IDs and our app ID here in order for us to register that in code, which we'll see in one bit. The final thing we need to do in the server is something very, very hidden, and that is down in something called the manifest. You can see there's a manifest option down here, and if we go into that, there is a Microsoft Graph app manifest, and inside that there is something among a lot of other features. Down in line 34 there will be a request access token version. That value is null, and that means that if you don't specify anything, it will fall back to version 1, and version 1 doesn't work with MCP servers. So you need to go into this JSON file, take that null away, put in 2 and save, because else it doesn't run on version 2 of request access tokens. Very, very hidden. Luckily I found a video online that talks about that, because before that it wouldn't work. On client side, we also have a fairly simple app registration. We don't need secrets, we don't need redirects, we don't need any application UIs and stuff like that. But what we do need is down in API permissions, we need to say add a permission. We need to say APIs in my organization. We need to find the server. And then when you choose the server, you can choose between application, meaning a fixed user, or delegate permissions, meaning dynamic who logs in. And if you choose that, you can choose the access as users that we made over here, in order to bind the two client and server together. So that is everything we need up in the Azure portal. Then we come to the code. The code is in the sample app as always, but what we need to do is we of course need to make some tools, and tools are just normal MCP. If you haven't seen that, go look at the previous videos. But we set the server tool type on the class and the server tool on each method. And in order for this to in order for us to check who the user is, we can then use the HTTP context accessor and getting out the user. And for that, we can find the preferred username, which will be the email. So in that way, we can always check in a tool, here's the user, what does that user have access to, and let's say we have a tool that reported back some documents. We could take all the documents that user have access to and leave out the ones they don't have. So that is the way, and one of the hard things that we have done instead of just an API key, in order to actually be able to see that is the user logged in right now. The other file we have, among 3 files in total that has been changed in just a normal ASP.NET Core empty page, is the app settings JSON. There we put in 3 things. We need to put in the login page for authority in terms of authentication. And the grid here is actually just the tenant ID of your Azure portal. Then we have the audience, and the audience and the scope here is, the scope is the one we put in the server, and this ID here is essentially just the client ID, and we put that as audience, and the scope with the access as user, or whatever you call your scope. And then we have the main part of the thing, which is the program. Of course, you can put it out into multiple files, but we do a normal web application, and from the app JSON, we read the authority, audience, and scope. We then add the HTTP access context accessor, so we can get the user out from the tools, else we don't have access to that object. So that's just normal dependency injection. And then we do authentication. So we add authentication where we use JWT bearers and MCP authentication defaults. One for the authentication scheme and one for the challenge scheme, meaning that we can pop up the login. Then we add the JWT bearer, where we tell the authority audience and how we want to validate our tokens. And then we put in .add_MCP here, which gives a little extra resource information on how we do the logins and the scopes. Then we say add authorization, and the builder part of the authentication and authorization is done. Then we add the MCP server as normal, with just registering everything in the assembly or however you want to register your tools. We do user authentication and authorization, and then we map MCP, but instead of not having anything here or having in the previous video that we set up that we need an API key, we simply say require authorization for that endpoint in order for this to work. So as you can see, the code is fairly small, but it's for a non-security guy like me, it's very, very difficult to find the right things to put in because it's so difficult and so foreign to me, at least. But at least it works in Visual Studio Code, as we mentioned before. So in Visual Studio Code, we just make an MCP server like normal, because I take this code and I deploy it up in a web app, because if I just press F5, this cannot really run because the MCP servers here can't use localhost. I also tried with a dev tunnel and still it wouldn't work. So I needed to have a real site, so I made a free website, MCP server with OAuth.azurewebsite.net. And if I start that tool, instead of just logging in, as we've seen before with no OAuth or API keys, we are treated with this message that it wants to authenticate to Microsoft. We say allow, and we log in. And once we have logged in, we just get access to the tools. If we don't log in, or we don't have log in with something that don't have access to the app registration, meaning it's not part of that Microsoft Entra tenants, then we are told not to use the tools. So that is everything. Again, I really want at some point to get multiple of these in, but that code is out of my hands. I will continue to try and figure out if I can find some ways, and if some of the other clients gets more support, or I find ways around it, or you find ways around it, please put it in the comments and help me figure out how we can get to the last final step. But this so far is where we at. It is possible, but it's mostly Entra ID and the MCP protocol that are fighting against each other. And when something is not supported out of the box, it is difficult to get something to work. So we can do it with VS Code. We know that. And in terms of being an MCP client myself, I don't really have that requirement or want. If I were to consume an MCP server using another tool, for example, an agent, an agent framework, I would just use API keys. There's no real need for OAuth because it would be a server-side level system that can't really do MCP authentication against the user anyway. So why bother with OAuth in that case when you have simple API keys? But that's where we are right now. If you want to contribute and help with getting the final parts, please do so. But else, see you in the next one.